before the 13th century, most Christian scholars viewed things like witchcraft and magic as pagan superstition. St. Augustine argued only God could suspend the laws of the universe, therefore supernatural powers were not possible, and it was, quote, an error of the pagans to believe in such things. This isn't to say accusations of magic being used for harm didn't occur. Charlemagne had to go as far as to ban execution of witches, indicating the execution itself was murder. But these accusations were dismissed as hysteria and superstition by the Catholic Church and most Catholic scholarship. But a shift began with the Cathar movement, which argued that both God and Satan had supernatural powers and were at war with each other, rather than God alone being able to act outside of natural law. Pope Innocent III declared this a heresy and called for a crusade against the Cathars, seizing property and spreading rumors the Cathars themselves were Satan worshippers. Some supporting this crusade claimed the Cathars took the name, quote, from the term cat, whose posterior they kiss, in whose form Satan appears to them. Ironically, this argument that the Cathar themselves are worshippers of Satan shifted public understanding of Satan closer to the Cathar way of thinking, as the argument reinforced the idea of Satan being an active and sinister supernatural force in the world. Later, the writings of Thomas Aquinas helped further this idea when he argued that the world was full of evil and dangerous demons trying to lead men into temptation. In terms of witchcraft, he argued that demons could take the form of women to seduce men so they could reproduce. He wrote, if some are occasionally begotten from demons, it is not from the seed of such demons, nor from assumed bodies, but from the seed of men taken for the purpose, as when the demon assumes first the form of a woman, then afterwards of a man. All of this led some Christian scholars to believe that collaboration with the devil could bring a person supernatural powers, and that Satan could create powerful, inherently evil beings capable of magic. Through this shifting beliefs around the supernatural, in some places inquisitions changed from being focused on finding heretics to hunting for supernatural sorcerers and witches. Medical practitioners such as midwives were particularly vulnerable to accusations because their treatments could be viewed as magical in nature and their failures could be viewed with malicious intent. Even with this shift among scholars, until the 1400s, witch trials were still rare as compared to heresy trials. If and when an accusation specifically of witchcraft was applied by church authorities, it would almost always be to prominent members of the church or political figures, and usually it was still more about heretical acts or thoughts rather than actual devil worship or demonic acts. Probably the most famous example of this being the burning of Joan of Arc in 1431. But around this same time, the belief in and fear of diabolical witch covens began to grow, leading to formal witch trials in some communities. In 1428, in what is now Valais, Switzerland, a formal trial court was set up to locate those involved in witchcraft and sorcery. The legal threshold that court set for arrest and imprisonment was, quote, public talk or slander of 3 or 4 neighbors. Torture could be used for interrogation if someone was, quote, slandered by 5, 6, 7, or more persons up to the number of 10 who were qualified to do so and not under suspicion themselves. One contemporary account of the trial stated the investigations went on well into the 1430s and that more than 200 people were burned at the stake. While we have few specific trial records of those early proceedings, there is one trial we do have a very detailed account of. It involved a woman by the name of Persona Gape in 1465. Persona was accused of trying to kidnap an infant and causing the death of the child by some sort of malicious magic. She denied the charge until an inquisitor from the church became involved and began to torture her. During the torture, she not only confessed to the accusations made against her, but to a number of things she was never accused of, such as meeting with the devil and eating the flesh of another infant at some sort of group assembly of devil worshippers. Despite no witnesses to any of these accounts, and her only making these confessions while being tortured, she was still sentenced to death and burned alive. In 1468, Pope Paul II declared witchcraft crimen acceptum, meaning that all legal limits on torture were officially removed in the investigation process for witchcraft. Sometime around 1474, a German clergyman by the name of Heinrich Kramer was appointed as inquisitor for the areas of Tyrol, Salzburg, Bohemia, and Moravia, areas in what are now Austria and the Czech Republic. Kramer requested and was granted a papal bull, or a public decree from Pope Innocent VIII, reaffirming the Church's position that witches existed to allow him to conduct formal investigations and hearings on witchcraft. Kramer went to the town of Ravensburg in southern Germany and began preaching about the dangers of witchcraft and convincing people to turn their neighbors in. Kramer was able to convince the city council to allow him to hold a formal inquest. As a result, at least 2 women, and by some accounts as many as 8, were convicted and executed, most likely by burning. Kramer then moved south into the town of Innsbruck in what is now Austria, and filed a charge against a woman by the name of Helena Schuberin. Kramer wrote that he had called Helena to meet with him to ask why she had stopped sending his sermons. Kramer wrote that Helena had stated that she believed his interpretation was heretical, as he only preached against witches, and he said, quote, She added that I had given the method of striking a pail in order to gain knowledge of a sorceress who had taken milk from cows, and when I stated I cited these things against them by way of censure rather than for instruction, she stated that in the future she would never attend my sermons after release. Kramer also said that at one point while passing on the street, Helena spat and cursed him publicly, saying, "Fie on you, you bad monk. May the falling evil take you." During the trials and inquiries that followed, a total of 13 people were also accused of witchcraft. The local bishop overseeing Kramer's investigation said of him, quote, "He presumed much that had not been proved, and was concerned Kramer may be, quote, completely childish on account of his age, or put another way, senile." In the end, everyone who was charged was either freed or received a mild sentence and some sort of penance, which was far less than Kramer believed was appropriate. And in 1486, the bishop asked Kramer to leave his diocese in a formal letter and suspended all the witch trials. Almost certainly in direct response to his efforts being stopped in Innsbruck and the bishop's dismissal, Kramer wrote a book called Malleus Maleficarum, which translated from Latin means Hammer of the Witches. Malleus Maleficarum was first published in 1486. Kramer used the papal bull he had been given 2 years prior as the introduction to the book, making it appear the book had a papal endorsement even though the decree was largely unrelated. The book advocated the use of torture and manipulation in interrogation. He wrote, quote, "And when the implements of torture have been prepared, the judge, both in person and through other good men zealous in the faith, tries to persuade the prisoner to confess the truth freely. But, if he will not confess, he bid attendants to make the prisoner fast to the strapado or some other implement of torture. The attendants obey forthwith, yet with feigned agitation. Then, at the prayer of some of those present, the prisoner is loosed again, and taken aside and once more persuaded to confess, being led to believe that he will in this case not be put to death." Kramer conceded that confession under torture should be affirmed without torture to, quote, "certify that it was not due to the force of the torture. But, quote, if the prisoner will not confess the truth satisfactorily, other sorts of torture must be placed before them, with the statement that unless he will confess the truth, he must endure these also. But if not even thus can be brought into terror to the truth, then the next day or the next, but one is to be set for a continuation of the tortures, not a repetition. For it must not be repeated unless new evidence is produced. The judge must address the prisoners the following sentence: We, the judge, etc., do assign you such and such day for continuation of the tortures, and from that your own mouth the truth may be heard, and the whole may be recorded by the notary." Kramer's rationalization for all of this was arguing God would never allow an innocent person to be convicted of witchcraft. He wrote, quote, "But here we are dealing with actual events, and it has never been known that an innocent person has been punished on suspicion of witchcraft, and there is no doubt that God will never permit such a thing to happen." Kramer's book specifically argued that women were far more likely to fall for demonic temptation because they, quote, "are defective in all the powers of both soul and body." He argued women have, quote, "a temperament toward flux," and that they were more lustful than men. He went on to write, "A person of bad reputation and shameful habits of faith is easily defamed as a heretic. Indeed, it is a general rule that all witches have been slaves from a young age to carnal lust and various adulteries, just as experience teaches." He believed they must be lustful in order to, quote, "perform the filthy carnal acts with demons," and he further wrote, "Woman, therefore, is evil as a result of nature because she doubts more quickly in the faith." The book was not endorsed by Kramer's superiors at the University of Cologne or the Catholic Church generally, but it still became quite popular. As many as 20 separate editions were published between 1486 and 1520, and following its publication on multiple occasions, Kramer was summoned to give an expert consultation and training to other inquisitors based on his writing. He was also appointed as a papal ambassador by Pope Alexander VI in 1500. Most scholars agree that following the publication, the victims of witch trials became even more overwhelmingly women. The largest number of witch trials in Europe occurred between 1530 and 1630, taking place in both Catholic and Protestant areas. One of the largest outbreaks of witch hunts came in what is now modern Germany. Between 1587 and 1593, an estimated 368 people were burned alive across 22 villages near the city of Trier. An eyewitness to some of these events wrote the following: "Inasmuch as it was popularly believed that the continued sterility of many years was caused by the witches through the malice of the devil, the whole country rose to exterminate the witches." This movement was promoted by many in office who hoped for wealth from the prosecution. And so, from court to court throughout the towns and villages of all the dioceses, scurried special accusers, inquisitors, notaries, jurors, judges, constables, dragging to trial and torture human beings of both sexes and burning them in great numbers. Scarcely any of those who were accused escaped punishment or were spared, even the leading men of the city of Trier. For the judge, 2 with the burgomaster, several councillors, and associate judges, canons of sundry collegiate churches, parish priests, rural deans were swept away in this ruin. So far at length did the madness of the furious populace of the courts go for this thirst of blood and booty, that there was scarcely anybody who was not besmirched by some suspicion of this crime. Elsewhere in Bavaria, in the bishopric of Eichstätt, at least 197 women and 27 men were executed for witchcraft between 1562 and 1630. In the bishopric of Würzburg, between 1625 and 1631, there were at least 29 separate executions by burning of multiple people accused of witchcraft. Some of these were as few as 2 at a time. One was at least as many as 9 at a time. The chancellor wrote to a friend in 1625, quote, "As to the affair of the witches, which your grace thinks brought to an end before this, it has started up afresh, and no words can do justice to it. Ah, the woe and misery of it! And there are still 400 in the city, high and low, of every rank and sex, nay, even clerics so strongly accused that they may be arrested at any hour. It is true that, of the people my gracious prince here, some out of all offices and facilities must be executed. Clerics, electoral councillors and doctors, city officials, court assessors, several of whom your own grace knows. There are law students to be arrested. The prince bishop has over 40 students who are soon to be pastors. Among them 13 or 14 are said to be witches. A few days ago a dean was arrested. 2 others who were summoned have fled. The notary of our church consistory, a very learned man, was yesterday arrested and put to torture. In a word, a third part of the city is surely involved. The richest, most attractive, most prominent of the clergy are already executed. A week ago a maiden of 18 was executed, of whom it is everywhere said that she was the fairest in the whole city, and it was held by everywhere a girl of singular modesty and purity. She will be followed by 7 or 8 others of the best and most attractive persons. And thus many are put to death for renouncing God and being at the witch dances, against whom nobody has ever else spoken a word. To conclude this wretched matter, there are children of 3 and 4 years, to the number of 300, who are said to have intercourse with the devil. I have seen put to death children of 7, promising students of 10, 12, 14, and 15. Of the nobles, but I cannot and must not write more of this misery. There are persons of yet higher rank who you know and would marvel to hear of, nay, would scarcely believe it. Yet justice be done. In the bishopric of Bamberg, when a frost destroyed an entire year's harvest, sorcerers and witches were blamed. A nun in the area wrote, quote, "A loud cry went up in the city. People were frightened to death as they awoke to find the unnatural night frost had killed off all the fruit trees, rendered the ground as hard as stone, and put pain to the grain harvest. Our prince was furious. As a result, between 1627 and 1631, hundreds of people were executed, most by fire, some beheaded. By some accounts, the executions only ceased because peasants refused to keep providing wood. Those accused still remained imprisoned until the prince bishop was replaced in 1631, and all imprisoned were released. Even after the release, sporadic witch hunts in the area continued, and by most estimates, the total deaths were over 1,000 just in that bishopric alone by 1680. In Protestant Scotland in 1590, King James, who is probably best known for the King James Bible, was already very interested in witch trials based on his reading about the events in Germany at the time. He traveled to the European mainland to get married to Anne of Denmark, but on their return to Scotland they experienced terrible storms that forced them to shelter in Norway for several weeks. When the Danish finance minister accused the admiral of the Royal Navy of under-equipping the ships, Admiral Peter Monk defended himself by saying the storm was the result of witchcraft. A woman by the name of Anne Coldings was already imprisoned in Copenhagen after being found guilty on an unrelated witchcraft allegation and was awaiting execution. Admiral Monk asked the mayor of Copenhagen to interrogate her for the storm as well, and unsurprisingly, while being tortured, she confessed. Coldings was executed by burning in July 1590, and 5 other women she named while being tortured were also arrested. As a result, eventually 12 women in addition to Coldings were executed, at least 2 of which being burned alive. King James, hearing all of this once he arrived in Scotland, decided to set up his own tribunal there. As a result of this inquiry, more than 100 suspected witches were arrested in the North Berwick area. Agnes Sampson, a respected elderly healer and midwife from the village of Humble, was one of those accused but refused to confess. As a result, she was tortured. Her head and body hair were shaved, as it was believed witches would have a, quote, privy mark, as where, quote, the devil doth lick them with his tongue in some private part of their body, before he doth receive them into service. She was fastened to the wall of her cell with a torture device known as the scold's bridle, an iron instrument with 4 sharp prongs, which are forced in the victim's mouth so that the 2 prongs press against the tongue and 2 others against the cheek. She was not allowed to sleep. A London publication of the time reported that she was constricted, quote, with a rope according to the custom of that country, being a pain most grievous, which she continued almost an hour, during which time she would not confess to anything until the devil's mark was found upon her privates, and then she immediately confessed to whatsoever was demanded of her, and justifying those persons aforesaid be notorious witches. Her confession was used in 53 separate indictments against herself and others, and as a result she was convicted, strangled, and burned as a witch. King James went on to write a book entitled Daemonology, where he argued that the torture-driven confessions were successful outcomes where the truth of demonic corruption was exposed. At least one Scottish historian estimates that between 3,000 and 4,000 accused witches were executed in Scotland between 1560 and 1707. When James took the English throne on the death of Queen Elizabeth, an English law was enacted that called for the death penalty in cases where harm by magic could be proven. The specifics around harm came due to the fact that it was a common practice for English villages to have healers who were considered to practice magic for positive outcomes, both men and women. In 1612, every justice of the peace in Lancaster was ordered to compile a list of people who refused to take communion in the English church. Some seem to have taken this as a way to gain the king's favor by rooting out witches, although James himself had grown more skeptical at this point in his life. Still, hundreds were killed for witchcraft, particularly in the Lancashire area of England between 1612 and 1630. During the English Civil War, the son of a Puritan minister by the name of Matthew Hopkins proclaimed himself witch hunter general and traveled the English countryside charging a fee to conduct investigations and witch trials. He used tests such as pricking, where a woman would be shaved looking for, quote, devil marks, which would not bleed when pricked, and he also used the so-called swimming test, where suspects were tied to a chair and thrown into the water. If they floated, they had renounced their baptism and were therefore witches. In 3 years between 1644 and 1647, it is estimated that Hopkins and his associate John Stern were personally responsible for the death of around 300 women. Around this time, with some notable exceptions, the witch trials overall began to decline across Europe. In Sweden in 1674, in Torsaker, there was a witch trial where 71 people, 65 women and 6 men, were beheaded and burned in a single day, primarily on the testimony of children who claimed to see an invisible mark on the witch's forehead. These children were themselves subjected to whippings, ice baths, and threats of being placed in an oven if they did not give testimony. The grandson of the priest leading the Inquisition wrote that his grandmother said, "I remember some of these witnesses, who by these methods were in lack of health for the rest of their lives." When one of the children pointed to the wife of the priest leading the Inquisition, she slapped the boy, and then he claimed he was mistaken because the sun was in his eyes. When it was time for executions to begin, the grandmother said, quote, "Then they began to understand what would happen. Cries to the heavens rose of vengeance over those who caused their innocent death, but no cries or tears would help. Parents, men, brothers held offensive pikes. They were driven, 71 of them, of which only 2 could sing a psalm, which they repeated when they walked as soon as it ended. Many fainted on the way out of weakness and death wish, and those who were carried up by their families up until the place of execution, which was in the middle of the parish, half a mile from all 3 churches, and called the Mountain of the Stake." In Salzburg in 1675, a woman was put to trial for theft and sorcery, and under torture confessed that her 20-year-old son had a pact with Satan. She was executed, and a warrant was put out for her son. 2 years later, government officials were told Jackal was dead. They arrested a handicapped 12-year-old who confessed that Jackal was the leader of a gang of children, beggars in the slums. Those they arrested claimed Jackal could enchant mice and make himself invisible. Eventually, 139 people were executed as followers of Jackal. Some were hanged, some burned alive, some after having their hands cut off, and some after being branded with hot irons. 39 were under 14 years old, the youngest being 10 years old. 53 were described as teens, and 21 were of unknown age. In the New World in colonial Massachusetts, the first woman executed for witchcraft was Alice Jones in 1647 by hanging. Few records exist explaining why Alice Jones was believed to be a witch, but her daughter was also accused of witchcraft 30 years later, but not hanged. We have more records regarding Margaret Jones, a midwife who was executed the following year, also in Massachusetts. The Governor John Winthrop wrote in his journal the following: June 15, 1648. At this court, one Margaret Jones of Charlestown was indicted and found guilty of witchcraft and hanged for it. The evidence against her was, number 1, that she was found to have such a malignant touch as many persons, men, women, and children, whom she stroked or touched with any affection or displeasure, or etc., were taken with deafness or vomiting, or other violent pains or sickness. Number 2, she practicing physic, and her medicines being such as things by her own confession were harmless, as aniseed, liquors, etc., yet had extraordinarily violent effects. Number 3. She would use to tell as such as would make of her physic, that they would never be healed, and accordingly their diseases and hurts continued with relapses against the ordinary course and beyond the apprehension of all physicians and surgeons. Number 4. Some things which she foretold came to pass accordingly, other things she would tell of as secret speeches, etc., which she had no ordinary means to come to knowledge of. Number 5. She had, upon search, an apparent teat, as fresh as it had been newly sucked, and after it had been scanned, and upon a forced search, that it was withered, and another began on the opposite side. Number 6. In the prison, in the clear daylight, there was seen in her arms she was sitting on the floor, and her clothes up, etc., a little child, which ran from her into another room, and the officer following it, it was vanished. The like child was seen in 2 other places which she had relation, and one maid that saw it fell sick upon it, and was cured by the said Margaret, who used means to be employed to that end. Her behavior at the trial was very intemperate, lying notoriously and railing upon the jury and witnesses, etc., and in the like distemper she died. The same day and the hour she was executed, there was a very great tempest at Connecticut, which blew down many trees, etc. John Hale was a 12-year-old and a witness to her execution. He was later a participant in the far more famous Salem witch trials in 1690, where 14 women and men were hanged on the allegations of young girls in the town. Hale had a change of heart when his own wife was accused during the trial. This accusation arguably was the turning point which brought the killings to an end in Salem. There were still trials and convictions, but nothing of the same scale after in the colonies. In 1706, Grace Sherwood was one of the last known persons to be convicted of witchcraft in the Americas, where in Virginia her neighbors accused the midwife of turning into a cat, and her guilt was determined by her floating after being dunked in water. But she was jailed rather than executed. The last known witch trial in the British Isles was in Scotland in either 1722 or 1727, depending on the account. A woman who was most likely senile and her deformed daughter were both found guilty by a local sheriff. The daughter escaped, but the mother was covered in tar, paraded around town on a barrel before being burned alive. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 largely put an end to witchcraft as a capital offense in England and its colonies. In Western Europe, the last official known witch trial resulting in an execution was in Salzburg, Austria, where Mary Power confessed after torture. She was decapitated and burned on October 6, 1750. In total, when looking at all of the records, over 100,000 people were prosecuted for witchcraft in Western Europe and colonial America between 1400 and 1750, with between 40,000 and 60,000 being executed. These numbers are generally agreed to be conservative estimates based only on the trial records. Some scholars have put the numbers as high as 3 to 4 million. Around 80% of those who were executed were women. History is awkward.